If you look at what's happening now, people don't know how to look at science and understand science from a research point of view. And therefore, they can't also do risk assessment on the science itself. They can't tell what's really dangerous or not dangerous. They have to rely on other people providing that information. It may be biased in itself. They don't have the ability to look at science objectively. Then they're forced to believe others. And I just feel like people are cherry picking their knowledge.
Hey, Karl, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing, Erum?
I'm doing great. Summer is here. I've been zipping around Brooklyn. There's so much activity happening everywhere in Brooklyn. And it's been nonstop from the Symphony Under the Stars, which was beautiful and an amazing experience, to the Mermaid Festival, to celebrate Brooklyn, the concert series that's happening all summer long. And we went to Philadelphia for Father's Day. It's been a whirlwind and exciting. I mean, I'm not tired. I'm ready to go. Summer's here. I'm ready to summer.
You're living the dream.
Yes, I am. What about you?
I'm a little tired because to talk about living the dream, I flew to California for a very quick 4 days. We went to go to celebrate our oldest son, Alejandro's graduation from Stanford. He graduated with a master's in earth science with an emphasis on ocean microbiology. So that was very exciting.
I'm so proud.
I'm very proud, very proud. I'm still recovering from that. It's always, that kind of travel is always a little bit jarring, especially when you do it over the course of the weekend. But California is always beautiful. This is great to see family and see Alejandro and talk to him about his transition into the world of work. It was very exciting. So now I'm ready to stick around Brooklyn, or actually stick around New York State, because soon some of these podcast episodes I'll be recording from upstate in the Adirondacks, but I will be zipping back and forth between Brooklyn and the Adirondacks this summer. But there's a lot of exciting things going on besides us being bon vivants.
Bon vivants, feral girl summer. Do you remember that? Did you ever hear that term?
No.
That was like last year. It was like feral girl summer. And I think it's just enjoy nature and do what you want to do. But I'm a mom. So it's like feral mom, feral dad. Let's just do something fun.
And when you said feral, I was thinking Pharrell, because he was in the news for Paris Fashion Week, and he's wearing like this suit that he had designed that looks all like pixelated green camouflage, and wearing these round Tiffany glasses. So he was in the news. So when you said feral, I thought you meant Pharrell. But anyway, let's do some quick biotech news that I think might be interesting for listeners. A couple of things that I noted that I think were really very cool is the USDA, so that's the Department of Agriculture, approved labels for 2 cultivated meat companies, Upside Foods and Eat Just, for their chicken products. So that means that chicken products grown without the chickens are about to hit the market. How do you feel about that?
I'm excited about it. I think we talked about this in the previous episode, but there's been a lot of pushback on cultivated chicken products, but it's biomimetically the same meat. It is like the same chicken protein. So in terms of it having health effects, I don't want to say it's the same because chicken grown from an actual chicken, it's eating food, it's in an environment, it accumulates different chemical signatures that have different influences on your body. This has probably less of that, but if anything, there's less risk of different interactions happening. Anyway, I do believe that this is a great solution to eating meat in the future. Our population is just growing too fast and everyone's hungry for meat. We haven't seen a slowdown in meat consumption with any of the messaging about industrial meat and how it's affecting climate change and our water supply and land use. Unfortunately, that hasn't deterred people from eating meat. So we need a different solution, and cultivated meat is a great solution.
Yeah, so 2 things on that. One is that the prediction is that protein consumption, meat consumption will continue to increase because the world is very fortunately getting more prosperous. And as people become more prosperous, they want to eat more meat. I don't think that's going to go away. But the other thing that I find super interesting, because I've been doing a deep dive on this and we're going to write a report about it, is that something like 70% of the US land mass is used for livestock agriculture. So that means not just growing the cows, pigs, and chickens that we consume, but all of the food that they consume. So all the wheat, corn, barley that is grown for them. So 70% is a huge chunk of land. And doing something to save that land or reuse that land or rewild that land, those are all super positive.
Yeah. Rewilding is absolutely necessary. I had gone to the World Biodiversity Summit, which opened my eyes to a lot of the issues that come from monoculturing and the mass extinctions. I don't want this to be a podcast about advocating, which we should always be advocating for the earth, but and humanity and planetary health. But it is something that we need more of. Like if we can continue to at least save the biodiversity that we have, so less animals and microbes go extinct. We talked about that in the last episodes of the missing microbes or the invisible extinction. So how can we maintain that? And maybe it is this rewilding. I know that there are some companies like AB InBev that's looking at rewilding or creating more biodiverse land as a corporate initiative. So they are someone who's planting the flag. And I believe Walmart too, like they were represented at this summit. So yeah, biodiversity, like putting a price on biodiversity would be very interesting. Like there's a price on carbon. That is something we should save for another podcast.
I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's like some kind of more wild biotech news that has been making the rounds. There's a company called Pearl Bio. I think they just raised $30 million. And they are kind of breaking the rules of life by moving beyond the 20 amino acids that exist in nature. And they're developing a technology that can disrupt medical paradigms by producing new chemistries that perhaps can solve existing challenges in immunotherapeutics and maybe pave the way to completely new materials. I found this news to be really exciting because it's like a new way of looking at life and biology. Instead of sticking to the 20 amino acids, they're able to add new amino acids. And it reminds me of a company that I won't mention that we know very well that is actually creating proteins that are in the opposite direction of the way proteins are currently made, which also have potential therapeutic benefits. This is esoteric news for some of our listeners, but it just shows that there's this progress that's happening that is using life to produce different forms of life that have potential benefit.
Yeah, can you break it down just a little bit? It's probably part of the central dogma. But so we have amino acids that help build out proteins, and the proteins are what helps create more macromolecules that make up our muscles and tissues and everything else that comprises of our bodies. But walk us through that just so we know. All right, so what is the state today? And if we have a new amino acid, like what can happen? I know you mentioned immunotherapies, but like what else can happen if you have a new amino acids? What would be different phenotypes? If it were...
Being able to use new amino acids or the amino acids that aren't found in life means that you can create different kinds of chemistries that would interact differently with the human immune system. So for example, you mentioned immunotherapy. Immunotherapy is the use of the immune system to fight disease. It's a way of fighting cancer that is growing in popularity, and it's a very precise way of targeting cancer cells. And so if you can introduce these novel amino acids into a protein, they could potentially be more effective in targeting a cancer cell, for example. I might not be getting it 100% right. If you're a listener and you know I'm getting it wrong, please let us know in the comments. But that's the way I see it. It's like you're incorporating new amino acids into proteins, and those amino acids will give those proteins different performance characteristics.
That's really interesting. We'll definitely have to get someone from Pearl Bio on the podcast and just hear about how they even came up with this concept and what is this new amino acid? What's it called? I'm sure people can Google search it, but we should hear it from the source. We'll work on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I know that scientists have been working on these new amino acids for some time, but I just haven't seen anybody apply them in this way. And then on the kind of more IT technology front, I think we mentioned this a couple of podcasts ago where we talked about Apple Vision, but you were telling me about Apple Vision before we started recording. What is it about it that makes you interested in the Apple Vision?
I have tried a lot of VR, AR. Of course, I watched the Apple Vision trailer or their ad, and I was just blown away by how they're trying to level up. I think one of the things that I had mentioned before is that I'm still weary of the goggles being a form factor, like having something on your head. but I have listened to reviews of people who they have tried a bunch of VR goggles and said that this is by far the best experience because it's lighter weight. So it's not super bulky on your eyes. Obviously, it's beautifully designed. That's Apple, of course. And you don't feel like you're in a completely dark room because you still have some view of what's going on around you. Like you can still see your surroundings if you need to easily. And then just like the content. So people were just saying that they were listening to a concert with Alicia Keys and it felt like they were like right next to her. The movie watching experience, but also mentioning that the work experience, like they were able to do work, like drafting documents and, you know, how a lot of us work day to day is just on computers, on flat screens, you know, wearing these goggles, that it felt comfortable actually doing work wearing these goggles, using like avatars were a bit easier, not so disruptive or weird. When Apple designed something, I think they really try to make technology not in your face, although this is on your face. But I think for any type of augmented reality is that you can be in places that you don't have to travel to. And one application that I think is going to be very interesting in the world of biotech, actually there's several, but one that we were talking about is like the conference experience. So a lot of companies in the biotech space spend a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, exhibiting their machines or products at conferences, at expo centers, and they are very expensive. I think some of these conferences are like these syndicates that are just nickel and diming a lot of these companies, but it is what it is. And rather than bringing equipment to a different location to show it off to the industry, just put on a headset and explore in 3D the machines, whether it's a real movie or a simulation, and be able to get the whole experience just by wearing goggles. And then this can also stem to, and we talked about this, and I would love to hear comments about how do you gamify or simulate biological processes? Because if you're able to look at it differently or look at it in different ways, you might come up with different insights. Like for me, when I was learning about chemistry and biology, it was looking at a lot of graphs. Like I didn't get to see what was going on in the cell. So I had to really use my imagination to think about what was actually going on and math. But if I could just see it and more people can see it, they might come up with more creative ways to solving some biological processes issues or optimizing them or being able to create things. And I think being able to see it in VR or AR type of modality can really help people's imaginations click with practicality.
I totally agree. I want to make two comments. So first on that idea of education and biochemistry. So biochemistry is taught very linearly, and you end up learning all these cycles that happen in your body or in biology. And all of these cycles, they're all interconnected. But because the way biochemistry is taught, you have to teach it in a textbook. And so it's taught very linearly. And so you don't often see what the connections are between the different cycles that are happening chemically in biology. And you see these wall charts or posters in classrooms or in labs, and these charts show all of those linear cycles, but they are all interconnected. So I think a very simple, interesting application in this VR space is to combine all of those cycles together so that you could pull them apart and look at them individually, but also see where they're joined with each other. Because that's the way biology works. If you make an impact on a certain cellular process, there's a bunch of other cellular processes that are designed to prevent everything from stopping. The cell machinery will continue even if you stop one process. So that's what makes biology very exciting and also very complicated to work with. So I think a 3D modeling of all those biochemical processes so that you could see the cycles and how they're all working together could be a very interesting application. The other thing you mentioned, conferences. One of the things I've always thought is like VR should enable a lot less travel. All of this stuff, what it reminds me is that we're living in a world of constant change. That change is accelerating. And for us, what that means is we always have to be educating ourselves. And I think that to me, that's the perfect segue to our interview today with Linnea Fletcher. Erum, why don't you talk about Linnea and why this interview today matters?
So Linnea Fletcher is one of the most interesting advocates that I met because she not only is a scientist and she has PhDs in biochemistry, and she'll talk about her background a little bit more, but she also is an advocate for biotech education on the community college level. And I think that her passion about education and outcomes mixed with biotechnology is an absolute necessity in a world where the bioeconomy is growing and we need more people to be able to support these companies or create them, which we will talk about some more. So I'm really excited for our audience to hear our interview with Linnea Fletcher.
Hi, Linnea. It's such a privilege and honor to have you on the Grow Everything podcast today.
And thank you for letting me be on your podcast. I appreciate it. I like to share information about biotech with everybody.
Perfect. That's what we're all about as well. I'm just going to kick it right off. Why don't you give us some background in terms of you and your interest in science and biology and kind of the path that led you to Innovate Bio?
I always knew I wanted to be in science. I asked for a microscope in fourth grade and I got a sewing machine. It did take a while for my family to understand how serious I was about being in science. I was a double major in biology and biochemistry. Biotech was not a major. And I worked in labs as I was undergraduate. And in graduate school, I worked on pathogenic bacteria. I did 2 postdocs because I love working in labs in totally different areas. One was in immunology, and another one was looking at RNA, messenger RNA, and how it affects protein synthesis. From there, I realized I wanted to be in research, but my husband was a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and I realized I wasn't going to ask him to move. So I looked, what else could I do? And I really enjoyed teaching. I loved sharing what I thought was the beauty of science. And I felt everyone should see it because sometimes I feel like it's done too much out of a textbook. So I got involved with education. And from there, I ended up at the community college. I had several grants from the National Science Foundation, and I worked there for 2 years in undergraduate division of education. And I still feel it's my passion to share science with the public. There's so many careers in biotech and other areas that people don't realize. And what I still see is that so many people are still becoming MDs or lawyers. And I feel like it's a real narrow point of view. And they need to be able to see all the opportunities that are available as biotechnology continues to accelerate in terms of development. And I will say accelerate. Even if there hadn't been a pandemic, the opportunities in gene therapies and synthetic biology are overwhelming. People should know about it.
Yes, absolutely. So you had your PhD in microbiology at the University of Texas, Austin, and then you eventually chose to pursue education rather than research. But what led you to that decision specifically?
I realized that it was going to be hard to do both. And then, of course, with my husband, I wasn't going to be able to move and to another university and run my own lab. So when I realized that, I really thought about it a lot. And education called to me more than research. Now, I've been able, luckily, to combine both because as a principal investigator for a national center grant that focuses on preparing people to work in industry, I have to keep up with the latest emerging trends in biotech. And then also having developed funding for an incubator at a community college for startup companies, I also had to stay in research as a result of that. So in many ways, I've been able to combine both of my passions, education and research. And the best way to engage students is to put them right in the middle of the research at an early age. Don't wait for them to get PhDs or go to graduate school. Stick them in it in high school or even earlier if possible.
You ended up starting this biotechnology department at Austin Community College. You mentioned that this idea of getting young scientists or young people more interested in the life sciences. Why did you decide to start that program there, and how has the program progressed since its initial inception?
Well, interestingly, I kind of waited. There was 2 biotech companies showed up in Austin, and I said, oh, this is my chance. I'm going to go for it. Strategy, which is now another company, and Ambion, which is another company. They always seem to get purchased and then integrated into others. So I realized this is the opportunity to get students involved. I had already started a high school biotech program. And so I immediately started a college program. And workforce programs at community colleges are very geared to hands-on. And we all have industry advisory boards, and they tell us what we're supposed to teach. We don't tell them, they tell us. So being at a community college is a real positive to start a workforce program. So that was my push to do this. And what's really interesting at this point, I still have a very large high school program. And one of my grants has aided the development of biotech curriculum in high schools across the state of Texas that actually can get high school students jobs in biomanufacturing. But then what's really interesting, like so many two-year biotech programs, 50% of my students are four-year students who have degrees in biology and chemistry and can't get jobs because universities and colleges don't get funded to do that type of workforce education. They may have classes of 200. My class size is 12. It's like graduate school. I have industry teaching it. So the ratio of instructor to student is very small. It's all hands-on. I have the latest equipment. And even though we have lecture and lab hours, pretty much it starts with lab. Then during incubation, they go get a lecture based on what they're doing in the lab. And then they go back to the lab. So they have to do a lot of documentation, getting them ready for CGMP.
CGMP refers to the current good manufacturing practice, and they are regulations enforced by the FDA. CGMP are operating procedures to assure the proper design, monitoring, and control of manufacturing processes and facilities.
They have to do a lot of safety training. They do a lot of presentations, and they have lab practicals. So when they graduate, they know exactly what they can do in a lab.
That's amazing. It sounds a little bit like my own story where I went to school for chemistry, and actually it was specifically for forensic chemistry. And forensics is being hands-on, doing analysis, being in the lab. And that actually was an advantage for me to work in the pharmaceutical industry because I had the experience working with those mass specs. I really think we can do a service for our audience to talk about the differences between getting a biology degree, learning about organic chemistry, learning about the principles versus getting the hands-on approach to using the equipment. What kind of equipment are you using? What are those differences? So if you can illuminate us a little bit on that, that would be really helpful.
Okay, so for example, I still feel the basic knowledge is really important. But for students, the one problem with only teaching basic knowledge and not doing hands-on that's related to getting a job or having a profession is that students don't understand why they're learning chemistry. And it's hard to engage them in chemistry or biology unless they're doing the hands-on at the same time and they understand the purpose of that. Otherwise, they just feel like sometimes they're paying tuition, but they don't see the point of what they're learning. So doing that hands-on is really important. The other thing is they should not do hands-on that essentially too much of it is like a cookbook with an ending that's always guaranteed. That is not what happens in industry or real research. I call a lot of what we do guided failure, such that we give them open-ended possibilities for results. And then we see what happens. And they have to make all their own solutions. They have to design their experiments, run their experiments, and troubleshoot their experiments. This is what's going to happen in industry. And this is what actually happens in research. But you have to educate people and scaffold how you train them in this, because if you just throw them into it without training, they may get overwhelmed with that. And then I also feel like they should be using the exact equipment that they use in industry. For example, when you're using a microscope, use the microscope they use in industry. Don't use the one that uses a little bitty mirror that catches light. So like when my grandchildren wanted a microscope, I got them a real microscope. And when we have our students doing cell culture, whether it's in high school or the college, they're doing it in a laboratory that models exactly what's in industry. It's a clean room practically. They're using hoods. They're using the exact cell lines that they're using in industry. And when I have them purify proteins or make proteins, they're using the exact equipment that they're using in industry. So yeah, my students have to understand mass spec. They have to do, and like sequencing, we had access to an Illumina platform where now we're using the Oxford system and the smaller ones. And we have actually sequencing equipment at a high school and in college.
Cell lines. Generally, when we talk about cell lines, what we're talking about is a defined population of cells that can be maintained in culture for an extended period of time. These cells stay stable, and what they do is they immortalize certain types of cells. Could be from a cancer, could be from a different part of the body. And in the cellular agriculture space, when we talk about cell lines, typically we're talking about tissue cells from cows, pigs, or chickens that you can move from one place to another and modify and grow. Mass spectrometry, or mass spec, is an analytical technique that measures a ratio of charged particles. What does that mean? Well, it's used for determining the weight of particles or the masses of particles to determine the essential composition of a sample or a molecule. In the life sciences, we use mass spec to analyze low molecular weight compounds, peptides, and proteins in complex biological tissues. So it's an analytical tool that scientists use to measure the composition of a tissue. When we talk about sequencing equipment, what we're talking about typically is a DNA sequencer. These are instruments that are used to automate DNA sequencing processes. So you take a sample of DNA, and the DNA sequencer determines the order of the 4 bases that make up that DNA. You may have heard of them. They're A, C, T, G, or their chemical names are adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. Every time you run those samples through a DNA sequencer, we call that a read. Linnea mentioned a couple of companies, Illumina and Oxford System. Both of these companies manufacture DNA sequencers, or machines that read long strings of DNA.
So we have them do exactly what they do in industry, and we have exactly the same equipment. Because when you do that, that shows students the value of their education. And then when they go off to industry, they've already used this equipment. And even if they don't go off to industry, they have a way better understanding of what industry does.
Yeah, that's amazing. So much of the life sciences has gotten easier, if I can put it that way. For example, sequencing, high school students can learn how to do that. You've created a program that teaches biotech to high school students. What was your inspiration about that? And why do you think it's important for high school students to get that kind of hands-on biotech education?
My very first grant from the National Science Foundation was to set up high school programs. And the reason why I got involved is I couldn't figure out why I was getting high school students that couldn't think or troubleshoot. So I wanted to investigate what they were doing in lab. And then I realized too much of this was memorization, truths, false. Too much was out of a textbook. And then their textbooks were like 20 years out of date. And so instructors were going, this is not true. So right away, I'm going, one, that cheapens education. Should really use up-to-date information. And then their labs weren't up to date, and they weren't allowing the students to think. It was really like a cookbook with a predicted ending, and they didn't have to think. They would just do it, and they were like given the answers. And then if anything went wrong, they were told, we can't go back and redo it because we don't have time. We got to go on to the next lab. And I said, none of this is how it really happens. More information is not better. You can only give so much information in a person's brain. And that's not how you do anything anyway. And 2, troubleshooting is really valuable. It's not about how many labs you do. It's really how you do the lab. It's the quality of the lab. So I realized we need to change this. That's how I got involved. Now, it's really interesting because sometimes it's really hard to move from one path to another path, because it's much easier to just get people to memorize stuff than to scaffold information and train them in troubleshooting. So that's something the teachers knew how to teach, but I knew the material that they needed to learn. So we made a deal. I wouldn't tell them how to teach. They would train me how to teach because I was a researcher, and they wouldn't tell me the information they needed to learn. They would take that, and then in 3 years, they would go from 0 to 100%, and then they would turn around and teach the next cohort of teachers. So we set up a system that kept bringing on new teachers and supporting the existing teachers. So that's still in place to some degree, even though we lose teachers, we gain school districts, we lose school districts.
That grant that you received was to focus on high school education,
Right.
But you received several grants.
I have to admit, I do get a lot of grants.
That is another podcast, because I know a lot of people out there are like, how are you getting these grants? And I'm sure you have a lot of experience, especially since you've worked with the NSF closely. So maybe we'll bring you back on and talk about how to win a grant. But can you tell us a little bit about some of the other grants that you won? What was the focus of those grants and what were the outcomes?
One other grant I did was industry sometimes, how fast can you train adults who are changing careers and get them ready for work? Because biotech, actually, working at the lab bench or in other areas of biotech, is very similar to other science positions or engineering. So when you get changes in the job arena, like, for example, there was the case in California where they laid off a lot of airline technicians who were working on planes. And then how fast can you train them for biotech? So there was a grant where it was like, how fast could I train people who already had jobs in other areas of science or were adults who wanted to change their career and get into science? So that was really interesting, because then you're trying to figure out how fast can you impart this information based on the information they already have and get them to see the similarities so it doesn't look like a totally brand new job and they actually can relate to biotechnology. So that was one. Then the other one, every time you get a new area, emerging technology area, then you have to deal with that stem cells. So when stem cells became really important and you needed technicians who could not only grow regular cell lines like Chinese hamster ovary cells, but you needed to be able to do cloning and do stem cells, then I was part of a grant for what were the technologies and the different steps in doing stem cells. I did that both with college and high school students. They love to see differentiation into heart cells that beat in culture. That's really fascinating. And then crossover areas like nanotechnology. So how does biotech and nanotechnology intersect? So how do you take people who know electronics or nanotechnology and train them in enough biology and biotech so they can work at that interface? That was really interesting, because you had to be able to scaffold the information in a way, including the vocabulary, so you didn't overwhelm them all at once. And the same goes in the other direction, IT and biotech. And now it's going to be AI and biotech. So these crossovers is like, how do you get a person from one area into another area as fast as possible in a way that they understand and can see the different careers? And then, of course, I've been part of the center grant that the Advanced Technological Education Program at NSF has center grants in the 10 advanced technologies, and biotech is one of them. Nanotech is another one, IT. So I've actually was part of the first center grant many, many years ago, BioLink, and then I wrote my own center grant after the leadership retired. So I've always been kind of like in the center of the whirlwind.
It seems like there's a huge opportunity when it comes to worker retraining, especially given the tech layoffs that we've seen over the past 6 months. You mentioned that one of your first grants was training airline technicians to join the biotech workforce. How challenging is it to get someone who is in an adjacent tech space to move them into the biotech industry?
First off, they have to see they're going to get a good salary. So one of salary incentives, because they all have to support a family, because these are adults who already have families and jobs. Second, they have to be able to see that they're going to do it in a realistic timeline such that they can get a job. So you have to have the industry willing to take these people, and you have to get industry to advertise their jobs accordingly and know what you're about to do. And then third, you have to come up with a training plan that is going to be realistic to those people. So the whole thing is, it's all about making it realistic to your audience of individuals that you want to train and recruit from. And that isn't always easy. It's the vocabulary that blows people away, because you're going vocabulary from one industry to another. Plus, you can't necessarily go and advertise in the airline industry, okay, we want to take all the people that you just laid off and train them for another job. And then when you have jobs, you're not going to get them back. So you actually have to then do marketing in a way that reaches these people. And there are a lot of things that the federal government and state governments have for retraining. So then you have to be able to work through those agencies to find these people.
It's like fly into a new career in biotechnology.
Exactly. We could have used that. That was perfect.
This is what we do day in and day out. But for us, we always talk about how do you spark interest in biotechnology? And I love the fact that you pinpointed painting a picture, showing a vision, and then getting to the brass tacks of money. I think that, of course, that is for adults. What about for students? When they're not really thinking of salary, what is that inspiration?
It's interesting. So adults with family definitely think of the salary. Students may or may not think of the salary, but they really think about changing the world. They want to make a difference. To me, that has not changed from generation to generation. They want to make a difference. And biotech now has so many possibilities for making a difference. Synthetic biology is going to make a huge difference in green, sustainable manufacturing. And I know that's one thing that students haven't heard about. It's interesting. I'll just tell you a really good case study on this. In the petroleum industry, process technology, large-scale process technology looks very similar to large-scale synthetic biology manufacturing or bioindustrial. And as they explore the use of more feedstocks that are green instead of petroleum-based, we now have process technology programs that are interested in possibly adding that or changing that such that their students could also be doing that. Now, I have to say, it's going to be really hard because the petroleum industry pays very, very well. So bioindustrial is going to have to pay really well to outcompete jobs in the petroleum industry. But the one thing that'll engage students is that it looks and it is very sustainable. It's a green chemistry. I'll be interested to see what happens in the future with all of this.
We go out and we do talk to high school students, and they're definitely our toughest audiences. They ask the hardest questions. They're uninhibited in the questions that they ask. And I often say that the questions that they ask are questions that we would never think of just because we've been doing this for a while. And the answer is typically, we don't know, or no one knows yet. That's something that you're going to have to figure out. And hopefully that continues to spark their interest in learning more about the life sciences and what the possibilities are. But I agree with you. I think that this idea of using biotech to change the world, especially in the face of climate change, is a very effective way to get students interested in these technologies.
I actually have a question more about these students that went through your programs. I'm sure you speak to a lot of them. I would love for you to share some case studies or just some stories of maybe a student that was thinking of another career, then came across your program, or those that went through your program, where they landed. You can share a couple of stories about that.
You should come to our summit June 25th through the 27th in Washington, D.C. at the National Academy of Sciences, because we are going to have student poster sessions on some of the research they're doing, and I'm going to have an alumni panel. So one thing that we are trying to do now is to connect more with our alumni. It's been over 20 years that these programs have been in place. And so we have formed an alumni network to see what they've been doing. And what's really interesting is we always talk about students working at the bench, but you know what? They don't stay at the bench. And actually, many of them don't even go to the bench after getting their associate's degree or advanced certificate. And we're going to have 4 of them who are going to be interviewed. One of them, Colby Clear, is actually a field scientist too. He works for a company where he has to go out and train and educate universities how to use sequencing equipment. And he has a 2-year degree. He's training people with PhDs. He's an amazing person. The 3 others are in QA, QC. Those are some of the best paying jobs. But in different areas, one works for international flavors and fragrances as their global marketing person. That is really interesting. And we're trying to collect stories. One that is very close to me is that my grant coordinator, she actually got a 2-year degree from me, and now she's helping me run these grants. She started off thinking she was going to do nursing. A lot of people think they're just going to do nursing because no one was telling her about biotech. So she got a 2-year degree in biology, but as part of her microbiology course, they mentioned, well, you'd be really good in biotech. Have you thought about that? So that's when she went over and tried to find out about biotech. And then she ended up in my program. And Cassandra was probably one of the most amazing students. She actually developed curriculum for cell culture. She developed a cell line that went from adherent to in suspension. And then now she's working with me on grants.
When it comes to cell culturing or growing cells, there are 2 techniques Linnea mentioned, adherent and suspension. In adherent cell culture, cells are grown while attached to a substrate such as collagen. In suspension cell culture, cells are free-floating in the culture medium.
So I like to hire people, and so do a lot of these programs, who actually have been in their programs. But if you want to learn more about what people do as students who become alumni and that now are employees, if you go to biotechcareers.org, they actually got funding to interview students who are now alumni, and they profile all the different careers that 2-year students can get in the field.
I love hearing this because I'm talking to you, Linnea. It dispels a couple of myths, but one is the myth that you need to have a bachelor's or a PhD to be working in the lab, which we know is just not true. And just the idea that even high school students can start thinking about these careers in biotech. And then this idea of convergence that you mentioned, which we talk about a lot in terms of how all these fields converge and benefit from each other. There's still a lot of science skepticism or bio-illiteracy in the United States. What have you found are the greatest challenges to helping educate students about biotech or science? And what can we do to help address some of the science skepticism or the challenges around just bio-literacy?
I still see that science is like being reserved for a certain group of students. Maybe that's easier for the educational system. Maybe it's not. But I don't think teaching science should make it hard to learn. It should, in fact, be just the opposite. Because if you watch young children, they are actually really good scientists before essentially gets too boxed in. They're always exploring their environment. Maybe they shouldn't eat leaves as a 2-year-old. They're trying things out. They're like little scientists. I watched my granddaughter run across the grass, and when she hit a metal cover in the street and noticed the difference in the temperature, she stopped to check out what this was. That's a scientist at the age of 2. So I think there should be more emphasis on discovery than memorizing things. Personally, if they're really interested in science and science is made available, they'll learn what they need to know because then they'll be engaged and willing to study. So I think how science is taught should be changed. It's not out of a book. It's not memorization. It should be about exploring. What's really hard is many years ago, I got involved with a program called You Teach at the University of Texas. And it was started by 3 teachers who had degrees in research. That was their main focus. And then they got involved with education. And because they had been trained in research, that's how they were educating their students from a research point of view and not from memorizing a book. And so the idea you teach when you're educating people to become teachers, at first you focus on research. You become a researcher yourself, and then you learn about educational principles instead of the other way around. Because first you learn how science should be conducted, how science should be explored, and you turn people into scientists. And I'll tell you why I think this is really important, because if you look at what's happening now, people don't know how to look at science and understand science from a research point of view. And therefore, they can't also do risk assessment on the science itself. They can't tell what's really dangerous or not dangerous. They have to rely on other people providing that information. It may be biased in itself. They don't have the ability to look at science objectively. Then they're forced to believe others. And I just feel like people are cherry picking their knowledge.
There's so much to unpack there because on the one hand, so much of the sciences can be taught at an early age. And you mentioned your granddaughter, having them be fascinated with our natural world or the world outside of us, it just comes naturally to us. But then there's like media literacy, which is something that is woefully undertaught. And then because, there's been an ongoing war against science literacy, you have this population of people that tend to discount it very much. And I think a lot of it is fear-based because it's things that they don't understand. So I think anything that we can do, and we talk about this a lot on this podcast, the media could do a much better job. And we don't see the life sciences in the media as much as we should. We need more of that. But I think just across the board, we just need to help people understand that there is a level of education and it's accessible to all of us. It's not something that is very difficult. It just requires the effort.
Yeah, I do feel too that people have to remember that a lot of the science reporting, they're trying to grab audiences. If you read headlines in a paper, they tend to go a little more into sensationalism than they need to. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. You just understand they're trying to get you to read the paper. So, okay, fine. You're trying to get me to read the paper. I get it. I have no problem with that. I just have to understand the science better in the article to see what's right and not correct kind of thing and look at it. And then the other thing, what always amazes me about people is they don't understand clinical trials. They don't understand how drugs and products are developed. And they don't understand there's always risk with everything. There's risk with walking across the street. And here you're speeding down the highway, probably going maybe the speed limit. But even that, do you know how much your car weighs and what would happen? They don't realize what the risk is with every day. And then they look at the risk of other things. And I'm going, you have no idea how to understand the risk in biotech and what the FDA does. And you compare it to driving down the freeway. And you know what? That could be actually more risky than drug development. So they don't know how to do correct risk assessment. That's probably a lot more information than you needed, but
it is actually something we do talk about often. It's an expertise level that we want to bring back on our podcast, just even like biosecurity as a topic and what that means. Risk assessment for drug development. Karl and I have spoken about this from our day-to-day job when we work with our clients or on other podcasts. but it can be complex, but not really either. If you have a trusted source and you can present information in a very clear, crisp, visual way, people are smart enough to connect the pieces if they want to. And I think when people are affected by, for example, they have a family member that has a rare disease, they start educating themselves very quickly.
Exactly.
And then they become very knowledgeable and start seeing maybe their previous thinking was a little bit flawed, or they didn't think that much of it. They just trusted outside sources. But then they become very knowledgeable. They gain a framework on how to think about it. And then they probably know a lot more than people in the industry that might be working on some very specific part of a large process. But they start seeing that whole process and how they can gain value out of it. So for example, Karl and I went to this conference called SynBioBeta a few weeks ago, and they had Martine Rosenblatt, who was the founder of SiriusXM, was a computational scientist, so was a computer scientist, but had a daughter who had a rare disease and needed a lung transplant. She had a cause and she wanted to make sure her daughter lived, and she created a whole biotech company to develop therapeutics, and then started down this path of organ transplants. And now she is the founder of United Therapeutics and is focused on xenotransplantation and has made huge headway just from having a personal mission to saving her daughter. And she did not have a PhD in the sciences. It's so fascinating to hear her story. And I feel like a lot of people that once there's no other option, they start getting educated very quickly.
And that's what I mean. Science is available to everybody.
Yeah. The other thing we're seeing, and we've talked about it on the podcast, and we've had people on the podcast that are talking about consumer products that are, for example, replacements for palm oil, which is in 50% of all products. Our friends at K18 Hair, they have developed a peptide that slips under the cuticle of your hair and repairs keratin chains. And these companies are very biotech forward. They're very education focused, and the consumers that they target are hungry for this knowledge. In the case of K18 Hair, they're dealing with hairstylists, and hairstylists, they enjoy the product because it works. They want to understand why it works. Once they understand that it's a product of biotechnology, they want to know more about biotechnology. And we have gone out and we've done educational seminars for the stylists, and they always come back and they're like, we want to know more about biotech. Tell us where the impact is in our lives. So I think that the opportunity for increasing education around science in general and the life sciences in particular is just going to continue to grow.
Yeah. It's so interesting. You say that hairstylist. I actually treat my hairstylists like scientists because they've been well trained in hair color and cutting. They know a lot about the hair and how to work with the hair. And so I never tell them their jobs. They ask me lots of questions, though, and they tell me a lot about their products. So you're exactly right.
They spend time every day working with harsh chemistry, and that has health effects. So if we can start to transition, this is one of the K18 messages, if we can start to transition some of that chemistry to more biological processes that work with our biology, same with cosmetics, beauty product, personal care, how does it change the lives of hairstylists because they're no longer being exposed to harsh chemicals day after day, year after year?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's why K18 is accepted in the industry, because there are these people, the stylists, who are looking for solutions because they are, again, affected directly by the harsh chemistry. So when they find biology-friendly solutions, they're going to gravitate towards it. And I think even in this world, we all know that there is a lot of misinformation out there, but science illuminates the truth if done correctly. So I feel like that Carly mentioned people are thirsty for biology or just sciences in general, because I just think they just want to know what's true. Right?
You should really ask some of the public you work with, how many of you know about NCBI, the National Center for Biotechnology Information? I tell them your tax dollars pay for this, and you can find out about all the clinical trials, all about the orphan diseases, and all of the research. And they actually put a lot of information up there that is public sensitive, because it's not just written in a vocabulary that's not accessible. And most people don't know anything about it. But then it's interesting when people do get cancer, I tell them that's the first place you should go look. You should go look for clinical trials anywhere in the United States or even in the world. Don't just look at one place for a disease that might kill you. Do your research. And you're right. And then you do get people like that who don't want their child to die from some orphan disease or something that hasn't been well diagnosed. You're exactly right. And they can do it.
Yeah, it's amazing. So just thinking ahead and being conscious of your time, Linnea, where do you see the future of biotech in the next 3, 10, 20 years? And also future of biotech education?
Well, it's really interesting. I think the changes in technology are just going to accelerate. It's just going to increase dramatically, because they're making so many breakthroughs. Right now, gene therapy, if you look at all the new gene therapy that's being developed, and as soon as they were able to harness the immune system to go after disease, I said, that's it. This will make a huge difference. And then synthetic biology, all the changes in that. And the fact that there's a lot of financing through the manufacturing institutes to make that change. And because our United States wants to keep the supply chain close to home. But biotech education, I think, can change, but it's really a paradigm shift for people to some degree to move from, and it's going to cost money. And it's not easy to teach students from a research point of view and move away from textbooks and fund what they really need to have in their classrooms. So I hope it changes. It has a possibility of changes, but we really have to start thinking that our primary resource is our children. Now, I know that sounds maybe a little sophomoric, but to me, if we think of it that way, maybe we'll put more funding into it, and maybe we'll put more thought into how we educate the public and our students and our essentially potential employees, such that we won't shortchange them anymore. And we won't be using textbooks that are 20 years old. And we'll want to keep really good teachers. And therefore, we're going to pay them a good salary that's equivalent to what we pay people in finance. So I hope it's true that it can change as fast as biotech is changing. But I'm holding my breath a little bit. But we're working on it. We're working on it.
Yeah, we are working on it.
So, the idea of cognitive science related to education and the fact that it should not be out of a textbook, it should be in real time and get students to do it hands-on. That actually, when I was working at NSF, I looked it up. Dewey discovered this in 1953. So it was discovered in 1953, hands-on education, and we're still trying to get it in all the classrooms. And remember, if you think about it, a long time ago, it was hands-on, because what did people do with their kids as they were on the farm or ranches? Guess what? Education was hands-on. Maybe we should go back to that a little more. But it's been around for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in Copenhagen last month, and friends of mine have young children, and they roll them into a forest school, which is basically they're outside all day long. I think they're 3 or 4 years old, but they're out there every single day chopping wood. They have a saw in their hand, where I think some of my friends here in the US would be like, you're giving a saw to a 3-year-old. They're using saws, knives, but they're cutting wood. They have a purpose. They have a vision of cutting this wood into something, all hands-on, all outdoors. And I think that definitely, if you can get some of that into the curriculums here in the US and globally, where everything's just indoors in front of a screen, I think we'll be better off. We need to go halvesies on
Yes.
The digital world and the physical world.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh God, I have so many more questions, but I think we need to have you back on, because I'm just so curious about the incubator that you've been working with, and just a concept of applied research. I think that's something that I'm sure you have a very unique perspective on. So we'll definitely have to bring you back on, especially after this summit that's happening. We'll put all of that in the show notes for our audience to access. I really do appreciate that you're on here. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. It's absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary.
I appreciate that you have this podcast and you're looking into this.
Thank you. Yeah.
I should tell you for the incubator. So they now have the people who work in internships in the incubator. They now are hiring people sooner so they can have them more than just for a semester. So they can have them for a year. And then they developed a system, peer-to-peer mentoring. So now the students in the incubator are training the next group of students.
That's amazing.
Oh, I love that. It's a good self-operating system, which is wonderful.
It's very similar to what I did with the teachers, is getting the teachers to train the teachers once you get them going.
Yeah, there's nothing like training to learn what you've been taught. All right. Well, thank you so much, Linnea, for taking the time to speak with us today. We hope to make you a regular on this podcast to hear about your progress.
Okay. And with your help, who knows where we can go.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Awesome. Erum, what did you think of that interview?
She is, of course, an amazing advocate and a leader. She is an amazing leader to really bring more people into biotech, which is what we do as well, which we are aiming to do through this podcast. So she is a kindred spirit of ours, and we will have to work with her in some capacity because supporting her cause is supporting our cause as well. She found an absolute need, right? She has been awarded these grants because people see the need of reskilling a workforce or introducing biotechnology in the high school level or in the college level so people can really think about where their strengths are and how they could perhaps, rather than becoming a nurse or going down a route that isn't really their strength, they can apply that to biotechnology and have a rewarding career for themselves. So it's really trying to introduce people who might not have even thought about biotech as a career path, but when they're introduced to it, they go all in. Obviously, we are evangelists. So for us, we're very passionate about it. And we want to see who else out there is passionate about being able to leverage this technology in a responsible way that can help save our planet and people that are unhealthy.
Yeah, we're huge evangelists for biotechnology. And I continue to be amazed by how simple certain parts of biotech are getting. And we know that there's a need for more fermentation technologists. Yes, there is a brewery within 10 miles of every American on average. And so there's got to be a lot of people who know fermentation technology, and going from fermentation to biotech is not a hard thing to do. But where do you learn how to do that? When you go online or even not online, there's a lot of opportunities to learn how to become a coder. I saw an ad last night on Hulu that was saying that there's 700,000 unfilled cybersecurity jobs, and it's an ad by Google. Google is trying to get more people to get cybersecurity certified so that they can fill those jobs because it's a need. And how long until we see ads from biotech companies that are offering those kinds of same certifications to get people in? And so offering these things, offering biotech education at the community college level is an amazing thing. And I know it was part of the Biden Bioeconomy initiative. And there was a long conversation from different people at community colleges. And I think Linnea has been on the front lines of that.
Yeah. And like you said, the barrier to entry in biotech is dropping from all the automation. And it could either be entering biotech by supporting an existing company or even starting a biotech company. Even that barrier to entry is reducing because we've seen in the market that there are companies that are making things a lot more easy to do sequencing or be able to design a molecule. And these tools and platforms that are becoming available are not difficult to use because as a business, you're trying to create an easy user experience for any user, right? Whether they have a PhD or not, you want to make sure that the user experience is flawless. Because even if a PhD is trying to use a program, they don't want to have to strain their brain in order to figure it out. And of course, and I want to say it, but I will say it, there is like a lot of generative AI. I hear that because we hear it so many times in our day-to-day, but that is something that type of technology is going to allow more people to participate, not only in biotechnology, but other industries that were hard to get into.
Yeah, one of the things that you had put this in the notes, and I think it's worth mentioning, when we talk to startups in early stage companies, we tend to focus on the problem that's being solved. What is the product market fit, or what is the business case for the company? And that is something that needs to be crystal clear from a storytelling point of view, because you can't get funds, you can't get customers, and you can't hire people unless that is crystal clear. But the question always is, where are the people coming from? There is a limited pool of people who you're able to hire for biotech. I think that if you're in San Francisco, in San Diego, Boston, or New York, or the Triangle in North Carolina, you have a pretty good sized pool to hire from. And the same thing might be the case in a lot of university towns. But that pool needs to increase if we want to see this bioeconomy grow a lot bigger.
If they're coming from New York or SF, or they have these Ivy League degrees, or even just higher level education, I'm doing air quotes, like what is higher level education? But they would command a higher salary. So from a business standpoint, if you can find people that would work for a lower salary, so someone that is expecting a $250,000 salary versus someone who's expecting a $90,000 salary, that's a huge difference. And if they can do the same work, then why not go for the person that has lower salary requirements? I lived this, and I think I mentioned this in the podcast, where when I graduated with a bachelor's of science in forensic chemistry and toxicology, I was hired at J&J, and all my colleagues were PhD scientists, but we were doing the same exact work because I had a command of software and automation and also the principles of biotechnology, biochemistry. But since I was coming at it from a software process point of view, I was optimizing the hell out of our standard operating procedures, which then over time required less of a headcount on our team, which then why would you keep a PhD scientist on when you have someone with a bachelor's degree that was able to do work faster? Some of these PhDs, they were older, like maybe 40 plus, and had families. So like they do need a higher salary. They need to be reskilled to do higher level work because I was coming in and doing that work. So there is this educational pathway that needs to happen for people that come from different educational backgrounds.
I think the thing that I learned, not just from Linnea, but also with some of the startups we've worked with, is that PhDs spend too much time in the lab moving liquid around. For example, that's what OpenTrons would say. And the PhD should really be focused more on designing experiments and having other people implement those experiments, because they have the skill set and the knowledge that allows them to be the designers of the experiments. And there should be people who are able to implement those experiments without the PhD being the one that's moving the liquid around. And I think what all of this is going to lead to is, as more people come into this, that'll mean that anybody who has the passion or the drive can start or join a biotech company. We know that there's infinite opportunities, and I think Linnea is doing the right thing, and I'm really going to be super happy to have her on again to just hear about her progress, hear about this conference she was talking about, hear what she's seeing from other community colleges, and seeing how the curriculum might change to get more people in, get younger people in, get younger people more excited about biotechnology, which is something we've talked about in the past.
Yeah, and that conference specifically is the Innovate Bio Conference. It's being held in Washington, D.C. on Monday, June 26th. We will have the link in the show notes if you're interested in attending. DC is a great place, so I'm sure you can combine that with a
trip to the Smithsonian.
Yeah. It's sponsored by Regeneron. She, meaning Linnea, and her team and her collaborators have some really interesting sponsors. So the biggest one being Regeneron, but a lot of other companies, Biorad, BioFab USA, the Center for Global Health Innovation, and many others. If you're interested in biotech education and learning what's happening in the space of how to get more people skilled in biotech, this is the conference for you.
All right. Closing it out, we opened up by talking about zipping around. It's a summer. We've got a lot of great podcasts coming up. For those of you who are interested, we do have a lot of podcasts that we pre-recorded. So we will have a lot of new content during the course of the summer. And then we're excited because we're planning a picnic for our Brooklyn Biotech peeps this weekend. And supposedly it's going to rain, but we've got contingency plans.
Yeah. Our Brooklyn Biotech Mafia, to be specific, because that's what we call ourselves here in Brooklyn.
All right. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening. Please leave comments, like us, and share with your friends. We get a lot of great feedback from the people we talk to on a day-to-day basis. And we enjoy doing this podcast, and we enjoy turning people on to what's happening in the rapidly accelerating world of biotechnology. That's the pod. Thanks.
See ya. That's a wrap.
Perfect.